Welcome to Radio US. In recent political developments, former President Donald Trump's statements have captured widespread attention, especially following his latest Trump news conference on trade relations. During this conference, Trump laid out a series of bold proposals aimed at altering the US's economic landscape. One of the key points discussed was the trade relationship between the United States and India. Trump pointed out that India, historically known for imposing some of the highest tariffs on U.S. goods, had been taking advantage of the trade dynamics. He explained that while India charged steep tariffs, the U.S. responded with reciprocal tariffs, making the system fairer and ensuring that both countries played by the same rules. This point was a focal part of the Trump news conference, where Trump stressed that by imposing these tariffs, the U.S. was not simply retaliating, but ensuring a level playing field for American industries. The Trump news conference highlighted the U.S.'s position as one of the few countries using this reciprocal approach to counteract high tariffs and trade imbalances. Trump's remarks during the Trump news conference also highlighted the significant challenges faced by American companies, particularly in the manufacturing and automotive sectors. One key example he discussed was the impact of high tariffs on companies like Harley-Davidson. Trump reminisced about how the iconic American motorcycle brand had been forced to open a factory in India to avoid crippling tariffs, which led to a loss of American jobs. This situation, as Trump pointed out, is something that foreign companies could mitigate by choosing to build manufacturing plants in the U.S. rather than circumventing tariffs by setting up shop overseas. Trump emphasized that if foreign companies wanted to benefit from the U.S. market, they would need to establish a domestic presence, which would contribute to the creation of jobs in American manufacturing. The Trump news conference underscored his broader strategy of strengthening domestic industries by providing incentives for companies to produce in the U.S., thereby bypassing the need for tariffs and ensuring a more competitive economy. In addition to his focus on trade policies with India, Trump used the Trump news conference to advocate for the broader economic policies he championed during his presidency. One of his most notable points was his belief that tariffs, while occasionally leading to short-term disruptions like price increases, would ultimately benefit American workers. According to Trump, these short-term costs were a necessary sacrifice to secure long-term economic gains. He acknowledged that in the initial stages of tariff implementation, consumers might see higher prices, particularly for imported goods, but he argued that these price increases would be offset by the creation of jobs and the revitalization of American industries. This, he believed, was the foundation for a more sustainable and prosperous future. Trump pointed to the success of similar policies implemented by other countries, such as China, which used tariffs to protect its domestic industries and fuel its economic growth. In the Trump news conference, he reflected on how China's aggressive tariff policies had led to the growth of its manufacturing sector, despite the negative impact on consumers. Trump argued that the U.S. could replicate this model, but with greater success, because of the country's competitive workforce and technological advantages. The Trump news conference also included a broader discussion on the U.S. agricultural sector, a key focus of Trump's economic vision. Throughout his tenure, Trump consistently emphasized the importance of supporting American farmers, who he believed were being unfairly impacted by foreign dumping practices. In the Trump news conference, he once again addressed this issue, criticizing the previous administration for what he described as its neglect of U.S. farmers. He argued that foreign countries were flooding the U.S. market with cheap agricultural products, which severely undercut American farmers. By implementing tariffs on these imports, Trump contended, the U.S. would be able to protect its agricultural sector from unfair competition and ensure that American farmers received the support they deserved. He further suggested that these tariffs would help level the playing field for U.S. farmers, who had been hurt by the practices of countries like China and Mexico. The Trump news conference marked another chapter in Trump's effort to reshape U.S. trade policy, focusing on industries that he believed had been left behind in previous trade agreements. In his usual style, Trump also used the Trump news conference to discuss the broader implications of his policies on American job growth. He predicted that the tariffs, coupled with the incentives for domestic production, would lead to a significant increase in American manufacturing jobs. Trump argued that this would be particularly beneficial for communities that had suffered from the outsourcing of jobs over the past few decades. He pointed to the resurgence of the U.S. steel industry as a prime example of how tariffs could work to revive a key sector of the economy. During the Trump news conference, he praised the U.S. steel industry for its growth, noting that companies like U.S. Steel had benefited tremendously from his tariff policies, which had made American steel more competitive in the global market. He predicted that more industries, such as automotive manufacturing and pharmaceuticals, would follow suit, bringing more jobs back to the U.S. The Trump news conference made clear that job creation was a central element of his economic strategy, and that tariffs were one of the key tools in his arsenal for achieving this goal. Despite the positive rhetoric surrounding job creation, Trump's policies, as discussed in the Trump news conference, have sparked criticism from various quarters. Critics argue that tariffs could have a negative impact on consumers, especially those who rely on cheap imported goods. They also express concern that the global trade environment could become more hostile as countries retaliate with their own tariffs. The Trump news conference did acknowledge these risks, but framed them as necessary sacrifices in the fight for fairer trade practices. Trump argued that the U.S. had been on the losing side of trade deals for too long, and that it was time for the country to take a more assertive stance. He further suggested that if foreign countries were unwilling to negotiate on fair terms, the U.S. would not hesitate to impose tariffs and take other protective measures to safeguard American interests. The Trump news conference thus illustrated a clear message. The U.S. was willing to endure short-term discomfort for the sake of long-term economic gain. One of the most controversial aspects of the Trump news conference was the president's stance on the European Union, EU. Trump expressed his displeasure with the EU's trade practices, describing them as overly restrictive and unfair to U.S. companies. He pointed out that the EU had a 20% value-added tax, VAT, on U.S. goods, which he considered equivalent to a tariff. The Trump news conference also discussed the numerous lawsuits filed by the EU against American tech giants like Apple, Google, and Facebook, which Trump argued were part of a broader effort by the EU to undermine U.S. companies. He suggested that the EU's trade policies were damaging to U.S. businesses and that they needed to be addressed through reciprocal tariffs. The Trump news conference made clear that Trump viewed the EU's economic practices as a challenge to U.S. economic interests, and he pledged to take steps to counteract them. In conclusion, the Trump news conference served as a pivotal moment in shaping the direction of U.S. trade policy. Trump's proposals for reciprocal tariffs aimed at countries like India, China, and the EU were central to his broader economic vision of revitalizing American manufacturing and creating jobs. While these policies have sparked significant debate, the Trump news conference made it clear that Trump was committed to using tariffs as a tool to protect American workers and industries. His approach to trade was positioned as a long-term strategy to secure the country's economic future, with an emphasis on reducing reliance on foreign imports and promoting domestic production. Whether these policies will ultimately prove successful remains to be seen, but the Trump news conference undoubtedly set the stage for a more protectionist era in U.S. trade policy.